Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk about bias and censorship and blacklisting in the traditional publishing industry. This is something very important that you need to know about if you are considering attempting traditional publishing. And I wanted to include this in my other video, should you independently publish or should you self-publish? But the reason I didn't include it is that I wanted people to actually see that video. Whenever you talk about censorship, and particularly when you talk about censorship on YouTube, the YouTube algorithm tends to be removed from working on that video. So videos that talk about censorship, videos that talk about demonetization, they don't show up in the suggested video feed. They don't alert subscribers when I make those videos. They get completely buried, and I'll usually get a fraction of the views on those compared to videos that I normally get. And I've tested this out. I've made like 7 videos 7 days in a row. One in the middle will be about YouTube demonetization. It'll be like 3,000 views and then 250 and then 3,000 views. So if you talk about censorship, chances are the video is going to get buried, and I kind of expect this video to get buried, partly because of that, and partly because I'm going to talk about some things of a little bit more mature nature that are important to talk about in the context of censorship and blacklisting within the traditional publishing industry. Now, what you should know is that there is a very, very strong bias in the traditional publishing industry, particularly with some of the larger houses, and very much so in science fiction and fantasy. This bias expresses itself in lots of different ways. If you've seen me talk to John Della Rose, we've talked about it on the show multiple times, with the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America being a bit of a culprit with this, with with the Hugo Awards going out to romances in sci-fi settings that aren't really science fiction novels. Lots of these things are happening in the industry, but the big one is the gatekeeper complex keeping out certain kinds of books. So it's a very female-dominated industry at this point, and it's also a very SJW converged industry, which means if you are a person who expresses conservative views, you may find yourselves on the outs, and that has happened recently to Orson Scott Card, who refused to endorse gay marriage, partly because he's a Mormon. This is the guy who wrote Ender's Game, very well-known science fiction author, very successful, very good writer, and one that's very loved by people who like science fiction and has successfully had his books transformed into successful movies. This is a guy who is essentially hated on a lot of different circles, and although his books haven't gone out of print, he may have a hard time finding a publisher for his next book because there might be an actual blacklist, and he hasn't really tried to publish, as far as I know, since that drama has happened. But that's a really well-known writer, and this is a pretty recent thing. If you talk to other writers, it's pretty common. So if you're writing a book that has conservative themes to it, chances are it's going to be tough. And there's even sometimes they have like sensitivity readers and things like that that will tell you your manuscript has to be changed to fit the social justice narrative more clearly, or they're not going to publish it. And what do you do in that kind of situation? Well, you ignore the publishing industry, and you can do it independently. Now, the thing is, this has been going on for a really long time, and I'd like to kind of present you the canary in the coal mine, which is the Gore novels by John Norman. His actual name is John Lange, I believe, and he has a philosophy degree, but he wrote all of these novels called the Novels of Gore by some, sometimes called the Chronicles of Counter-Earth. Let me show you some cover art so you get the idea. This is some cover art from the 70s with some 70s cover design, which I like 70s cover design. From this image, you should get an idea what this is about. Essentially, there's this Earth on the other side of the sun, and you have characters from our Earth get kind of whisked off there. And on this Earth, it's essentially like a medieval fantasy. Most women are basically slaves, and there's a bunch of sex slaves, as you can tell from this particular cover image right here. This is something that goes through all of the novels, as women are literally physically dominated, like beaten, sexually dominated. It's a very strong, what most people would consider anti-female empowerment narrative that runs throughout these particular books. A lot of people consider them misogynist, sexist, and perhaps they are. The thing is, they're also very successful, not just with men, but with women. There's a whole subculture that developed called the Gorean subculture, the Gore subculture, where women choose to live this lifestyle where they are essentially sexual slaves to a man. And in the books, they're often presented, women are often presented as being sexually liberated through slavery, which is a weird thing. And the women who aren't slaves, like, are sexually repressed. And there's a lot of weird themes like that. Essentially, if you think of 50 Shades of Grey, but written by a man and set in actually a very well-developed science fiction fantasy universe. The world building is actually, I think, pretty good. I haven't read too many of these, and it's been a long time, but that element is actually good in a sense. So maybe it's sexist, maybe it's misogynist. Does that mean that you blacklist or censor it, particularly when you have a group of people, including women, who are really into wanting to live this lifestyle, and it became a whole subculture, like an S&M subculture. And you also have similar content like 50 Shades of Grey. Now, what happened with this novel is that the original publisher, Ballantine Books, didn't want to publish the books anymore, and you can maybe guess why, but this was a long time ago. This is like in the 70s. So Daw picked it up. Daw is a very famous publisher of fantasy, published a whole bunch of Michael Moorcock's novels and a bunch of other people. Very big fantasy fantasy publisher. And somewhere in the book series, they decided they weren't going to publish them anymore. And the official reason they gave was low sales. Now, this was after a slow transformation of the company into one that was essentially more dominated by leftist ideology. Now, the thing is, these didn't have low sales. They've sold millions of copies, and they have a whole subculture of people that are highly dedicated to them. If you ran a publishing house, you would probably want to be publishing these books to make money. Not only that, but apparently they had really good sell-through rates, which a sell-through rate means that you ship a certain number of books to a bookseller, like a bookstore, and the percentage of those books that they order and then sell without sending back, that's your sell-through. And books that are sent back, if they're hard books, they take the jacket off of them and destroy them and write it off as a tax thing. And book sales are complicated when you start thinking about them. But apparently he had really good sell-through, like a 90%. Like 90% of the books that got ordered were then sold, which is really, really good. Usually people don't have that kind of sell-through unless it's like the opening day of a new Harry Potter book or something like that, where you have like 100% sell-through or 97, 98% sell-through. So they do pretty well. John Norman, or John Lange, which is his real name, John Norman's his pen name, believed that this was due to sexism. But now, if Daw didn't want to publish them for whatever reason they decided, like they're too sexist or something like that, the ethical thing to do would be to release the publishing rights back to the author. And they didn't, as far as I know, initially do that. The rights will revert back to the author after so many years of it being out of print. So having written like over 20 of these novels, he was suddenly at an impasse where he couldn't publish any more of them. Daw refused to publish them. And what do you do? What do you do with that when all your books are going out of print, your publisher refuses to print them, and your publisher is not just giving you back the rights to find another publisher? Not only that, he couldn't find another publisher. He said he got blacklisted by the entire industry as a result of the portrayal of women in his books. And I also think he wrote like a practical, like, fantasy sex dominating guide for couples as well, just as an aside, that I think might have sold pretty well, or done pretty well, I guess, with the subculture that likes gore. So what did he do? Like, his books were out of print for, I think, like 13 or 14 years. They stopped being printed in 1988. So this stuff was going on all the way back in the 1980s. You already had a convergence of leftists taking over these outlets and acting as the gatekeepers, deciding not on what was going to be profitable for the company, but what was going to fit their narrative and what was going to be offensive and problematic to them. But you know that there's like a disconnect there, because if you've read 50 Shades of Grey, if this had not a man's name on it, it might have gotten published, because obviously there's some women that are into this, considering they subscribe to the subculture. So it went on like 13, 14 years. Finally, all the rights reverted back. Once you had the Kindle platform established, John Norman could once again find anyone to publish it or publish it himself. And I think there's like 30 novels or something that he's published. And I think in all that time he kept writing the books. So essentially he had to wait over a decade for the walls, the gatekeeper walls to fall down, and him to have access to a market to have more best-selling books and sell these books to people that were really interested in them. In the meantime, they kind of became collector's items. Not so much Tarnsman of Gore, which is the first one. There's like millions of copies of that around, but some of the Daub ones from the 1980s became really sought after and valuable because Daub wouldn't print to the demand of the market, and a lot of people were interested in continuing to read these weird little fantasy books. So that's kind of a canary in the coal mine, and it should have let people know what was coming later on, because and this is not part of I might call this like a slippery slope argument, if you will. The justification used to censor the original Gore novels because of their highly sexually explicit values and showing women being dominated and enslaved. While you may agree with that sentiment, that justification can then be transformed to be anything. If it shows homosexuals in some light that's considered unpreferable, boom, now that's another reason to enable your gatekeeping complex and to stop the book from being published, or to make authors make changes to the book that you want to have. So the justification, once that's okay, once the means are established as okay because they serve the correct end, then those means can be transformed and transplanted on anything you want. So you get a really effective block. Now the thing is that eventually somebody will come up with a way to get around these roadblocks, and indeed that just happened. Once the internet happened, people no longer needed these big publishers to gain access to readers. Readers could go directly on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and get the ebook or buy the physical book that they wanted to without any gatekeeper. The gatekeeping complex is a big one. A lot of people buy into this. They're like, well, I have, I'm actually published. It means, oh, well, somebody in some publishing company approved of what you're doing. Other people can sell way more books than you and not be approved because they just didn't need to do it, or because they had a good business plan in mind. Having a gatekeeper approve your book doesn't mean that like you're automatically better than an indie author. Especially really successful indie authors are probably not going to want to traditionally publish because they're going to make more money doing it on their own. But a lot of people still buy into that gatekeeper complex, and establishing that culture of the gatekeeper, and it's very big in academia, this idea that you have to work hard to get this agent approval and get these publishers to approve of what you're doing. That's important because leftists get drawn to those positions of power. You see it in politics all the time. Anybody who wants to have control over other people or wants to dictate how the culture changes, they search out those positions of power where they get to restrict speech. They get to decide what people hear and what people don't hear. People that are very attracted to like news networks and things like that, and being news executives and deciding what's on the news, they tend to be leftist, which is why you have like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, ABC News, like all the news stations are leftist with the exception of Fox, which is really, to me, centrist. There's no individualists anywhere to be found, because individualists are not interested in dominating other people's thoughts, so they don't get as attracted to them. That's the danger of the gatekeeping complex, kind of that ring of power, is it's like these are people who are going to decide what can and can't go into print, what readers can and can't access. At least that was true back in the pre-Amazon days. So you're going to get a lot of people that are attracted to the idea of being able to change the publishing industry for what they consider the better, even if it may be harmful to the profits of their company, and maybe even if it puts a lot of customers, basically leaves them out in the cold, and people are not getting the products that they want. So I'm kind of the opinion that it's great that we have independent publishing, because then we have a real way to get around the gatekeepers. What if Amazon starts acting as a gatekeeper? There's a little bit of worry about the way Amazon is treating romance novels right now, because it's restricting how romance novels get shown up for in searches. And to me, that's a little bit different. That's kind of like putting if you have these books in your store, maybe, I think Michael Moorcock actually might have said this, because Michael Moorcock was pretty critical of them for their content. He didn't think they should be censored or not be in stores or not published. He's like, you put them out of the reach of kids, like, they're behind the counter or something. I might have said like put them on the top shelf. So you put romance novels out of the reach of children, and you make people actually want to find those things. That's, to me, not entering the censorship realm. The censorship realm will be once Amazon does things like what, not just what YouTube does probably with this video, which is bury it, but starts to decide like, hey, you have sexually explicit content on the site, your ebook's done, and your account's gone. Then you're having a real gatekeeper. You have Amazon as a gatekeeper. But I think some of the reasons that they don't do that is, first of all, romance makes them a ton of money. So they're not going to turn their back on that amount of money. Like, at the end of the day, Amazon is still really profit driven at the moment. And then there's a bunch of competitors who would probably still publish it. And you'd have all these people who like romance and are giving you money. They'd end up just going somewhere else. So you're just kind of throwing your money away by trying to censor things or control the nature of the content that's on your site too explicitly. And you can still buy Mein Kampf on Amazon, and that's appropriate. People need to be able to access works of the past that are controversial or written by controversial figures. So anyway, I thought I'd share this particular antidote for you. Novels of Gore by John Norman. I don't necessarily recommend them. I think the first ones, I only read a couple of them, and it was a long time ago. They're certainly titillating. They're much more titillating than like Game of Thrones is in terms of their explicit content. And they have plots, they have good world building, but I don't know if I would say they're good. But that doesn't mean that I think that they shouldn't be published, particularly when there's a lot of people who really want to read them. That seems, kind of a little, it's bad for your company, and then not just giving the rights directly back to the author. Not the best thing to do either. So I hope you all will have a good day, and let me know what you think down below. This is a danger that you need to be aware of when you're considering traditional publishing, as well as that if you get a book published and then later, as what happened with John Norman, they decide that it's wrongthink, you may have to wait years for your rights to revert back to you before you to publish again. So you may want to just avoid that whole problem right from the get-go. And this actually happened with Milo Yiannopoulos. He was going to publish this book, Dangerous. There was this big, I made a video about him, Milo Yiannopoulos, Thought Criminal. A bunch of stuff came out where he was talking about like his, when he was having a sexual relationship with a priest, when he was young, basically being molested by a priest, and saying other things that were kind of like pederasty. And as a result, his publisher pulled his book, and it was already like a bestseller just from pre-orders, which like a #1 bestseller, which is a big deal. So it was kind of them flushing money down the toilet in a sense for PR reasons. And I think that's one of the reasons that you don't have like stockholders suing these companies, is you say, well, we can't publish the novels of Gore for PR reasons, that other people might boycott our brand because we're publishing them. So it's still a financial gain for us. And that's something that I think Simon & Schuster was going to be the publisher of that. I think that's something that you can spin. It becomes very difficult for stockholders to sue people for this because of that PR element that's there. But it's happening now, and it's been happening for a long time. John Norman was the canary in the coal mine. And I wanted to present that to you if you're one of those people that wants to write things that are highly political, or you want to be highly political outside of writing your books, as I am, and as many people are. Most people are political. There's no apolitical people. Then you may want to just look at independent publishing right from the get-go, because in that case, you always have your rights, and you'll never be out of print. You'll never be subject to the gatekeeper complex. You can find me at dvspress.com, davidvstewart.com, and you can send me an email, stu@davidvstewart.com, and I try to get to those. You can find all my books listed at dvspress.com if you want to check those out, and I'll see you all next time.